British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has been grilled again in the Parliament amidst a volley of criticism. Labour leader Keir Starmer criticised Sunak over the recent prison escape and spying allegations in Westminster. Starmer said that Sunak ignored warnings concerning the prison system and possible Chinese spying. He even branded Sunak an inaction man. Starmer even urged the Prime Minister to call a general election.
Probation, prison, schools, China, yet again inaction man fails to heed the warnings and then blames everyone else for the consequences.
Sunak hit back, claiming the Labour leader cannot be trusted due to his principles-free type of leadership. Sunak also accused the Labour Party of discussing plans to block housing reforms in the UK government's Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill.
Mr. Speaker, we are getting on for the British public just in the last week, announcing a new landmark deal for British scientists, attracting £600 million of new investment for our world-leading auto industry, and wages now rising at the fastest rate on record, Mr. Speaker. And where has he been this week? Locked away with Labour's union paymasters, promising to give them more power and scrap the laws that protect British families and their access to public services. It's clear it's only the Conservatives that are on the side of the hard-working British public.
Earlier, opposition MPs came down hard on Sunak in the UK Parliament, saying that the Prime Minister was to be blamed for the soft stance against Russia and the G20 leaders' declaration. Labour leader Keir Starmer turned the joint declaration as disappointing. On his part, Sunak replied, saying that the group of 20 economies and the G7 are two different groups. He slammed the opposition, saying that if MPs in the House are assuming that the group will reflect the same unanimity like the G7, they just don't get how foreign affairs work. Now, the Tory government has come under fire on multiple issues in recent weeks. On the forefront was the British parliamentary researcher who was arrested for spying for China. Reports claim the male suspect had links with Tory MPs as well. However, the 28-year-old has rejected all the claims against him. The suspect, Chris Cash, says that he's completely innocent. Some British ministers were informed about the arrest then, but the details were released over the weekend. Last week, a former British soldier managed to escape London's Wandsworth prison. The 21-year-old was accused of offences relating to terrorism and the Official Secrets Act. And the man in question, Daniel Abed Khalif, was arrested in West London after being on the run for 4 days.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties.
Now, for more on this, we have with us Mr. Adam Schwartz, writer and political commentator, joining us live from London. Sir, thank you so much for joining us. Now, to begin with, just for better understanding here, what's your assessment of the current political landscape?
Well, I think ultimately, we're sort of generally looking forward to the general election. Rishi Sunak seems to have sort of banked his premiership on the assumption that by giving himself the most amount of time in government, by having the latest general election as possible, probably towards the end of next year, he really gives himself enough time to really fix the main issues that are kind of facing the British electorate and the country as a whole, particularly related to the economy and on public services. I think sort of the fundamental problem that Rishi Sunak faces is that actually those issues that he needs to fix really don't have any kind of quick fix solutions and are in fact very much rooted in sort of long-term problems and structural issues. I mean, if you simply look at issues in the public sector, if we look at the National Health Service, if we look at the recent issues of schools not being maintained and failures in prisons, as you mentioned in your report, they're really related to the kind of long-term problem of the deliberate shrinking of the state that sort of happened during the David Cameron era. Now, the problem with that is that it's very difficult to suddenly build back a lot of state capacity. I think if you look at some of the other issues, for example, in the economy to do with inflation, those are and the impact on on mortgage rates. That's something that's very difficult as well to kind of sort in a short or even a medium-term time frame. If you look at issues to do with trade and the frictions caused by Brexit, again, those are due to kind of structural economic issues that can't simply be resolved in the period of a year. So I think really that's the major problem kind of facing Sunak in this kind of final year that we have towards the general election. And I think really that's why we see Labour leader Keir Starmer trying to sort of pin him down as an inaction man, because really Rishi Sunak has tried to present himself as the professional, as the technocrat who's come in after a very difficult period in government with Boris Johnson and a short time as Liz Truss. So that's really, you know, I would say that the fundamental issue kind of facing the British political landscape.
All right. And now that being said, now, as I mentioned, opposition MPs, they came down hard on Sunak, saying that the Prime Minister was to be blamed for the soft stance against Russia and the G20 leaders' declaration. Now, what would you say? How do you think that would impact the general elections, if at all?
I actually don't think it really will have a major impact on the general election. Or I think obviously, you know, Starmer is going to highlight that, seeing as it was a major issue of the past week, to try to sort of cast Rishi Sunak as not quite as the competent professional leader as he presents himself. I think the reality is that, you know, the British public do care about foreign policy issues. And obviously, you know, the British public still maintain very strong support for Ukraine in its context of the Russian invasion. But the reality is that the UK's domestic problems, particularly with the economy and with inflation, means that those really are the pressing issues for the public when it comes to actually voting. And I think if we look at the polling that's taken place really during the time that Rishi Sunak has been Prime Minister over the last year or so, really, you know, the priorities of the British public haven't really changed. And so I don't imagine that, you know, issues related to the G20 will really become a major issue. You know, I think that one area where that is perhaps related is the fact that, you know, a lot of global growth opportunities happen internationally. And so if Sunak can try to harness some of that, I think that's something that could potentially help him out. But overall, I don't think it's going to be the major defining issue that determines his success at the next election.
All right. Mr. Schwarz, thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast with your insights on this.
Good to be with you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.